Because as you waltz through anime fandom, every now and then you meet a Charlie, and every now and then you meet a Sam. and they're two very distinct archetypes in the fandom. And every now and then you meet a third type, a chosen one, if you will, who is just the consumer of all. And so one of the great boons of my life is that I am a Sam and a Charlie.
Hello, and welcome back to Gateway to Anime. How are you all? What's going on? Charlie, what's up?
Hi, I'm here to talk about some pretty exciting stuff. It's going to be cool. We've got one of my favorite guests on today. So, Gerald, hello. How are you?
Making me blush so that everyone at home can see. Good to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Jared, so good to have you. First time in the new studio.
That's right. Fancy. You guys leveled up.
We have. We're very happy with it. So I realized this is your fifth time on here with us.
Yeah, right.
Is it 5?
Yeah. Because we had Neon Genesis, Cowboy Bebop, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, Dark Fantasy, and now number 5 right here.
Okay, wow.
Wow, I've forgotten most of those episodes.
Me too.
I was like, did we do Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood? I was
We
like,
sure
let's talk
did.
about that.
There's always one sibling that remembers your collective life is better than the other. Is Sam.
100%.
I am the sibling that can't remember anything about my life, and recently reconnected or met up with my brother, and terrifying the amount of things that he can just recollect about our lives. So if you had to ask me, I would have said I'd been on here 3 times. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would have said the same thing.
Well, it's very exciting. So today, we're going to talk about the 2 unrecognized, undisputed kings. Now, there's a few little in-jokes all up in there. So for those of you who've been with us since the start, you might know that I have a propensity to proclaim things a lot. And one of my proclamations is that something is the undisputed king of X or Y or whatever it happens to be. Now, also for those of you who've been with us since the start, particularly back in season 1, season 2, Charlie used to talk a lot about one of her favorite or seminal shows, I suppose. One of the shows that really brought you into anime as a genre, right? And sort of changed your mind on what the genre can do, yeah?
Yeah, just totally was the first thing I watched that wasn't, a battle shonen that took my attention as much. And I was like, oh, there's more genres out there. It's a wide world. And it shaped my viewing to this day. But Sam, also, you really undersold that. You make wild proclamations about everything being the undisputed king. So if we were to actually have an undisputed king off, we should do that. We should watch
One
all
day.
the things that you've said are the undisputed kings and then make you pick one.
Oof, I don't know if I'd be able to do that.
That's going to be a lot.
That's going to be a lot, man. Look forward to that episode. But no, so basically, Charlotte has her, I suppose, one of her undisputed kings or queen in Fruits Basket, which she's talked about a lot since day one. I haven't talked about it as much recently on the more later podcasts, but you certainly used to bring it up a lot in the early days. And I, funnily enough, now, obviously, you'd be like, Sam, you're surely Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and that's fair. That's probably super accurate.
It's fair because you've said it's the undisputed king.
Yeah, and so for a while I was saying Attack on Titan until the ending, which is a damn shame, but that's a podcast for another time because at the time of this recording, that show hasn't ended yet. And, well, obviously the manga has, but of course we'll talk about that when the anime comes to an end because believe me, there will be discourse, not just from us, but from the whole community. But that's for another time.
Enough from me, because I've elected just not to watch the ending, and it'll always be glorious in my mind.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
You've left it off at a glorious time. Oh, God, it's going to be so interesting. Anyway, but those of you who've probably been listening to the more later episodes of this podcast might have picked up that I really like a show called Legend of the Galactic Heroes. In fact, I think it's so good that I have proclaimed it one of my, it sounds like I've diluted the phrase now, which is a damn shame, but it is quite possibly the undisputed king of anime for me. Now, Gerald here is a very diligent watcher of things and a writer, professional writer, and of course, longtime collaborator, and for many things, not just this podcast. But Gerald actually took up recommendations and went and watched them.
So he's watched both of these shows,
Yes.
2 shows that probably couldn't have been more different if they tried. Everything about them is very...
Here's what I'd say about that.
Here we go.
Because as you waltz through anime fandom, every now and then you meet a Charlie, and every now and then you meet a Sam. And then they're two very distinct archetypes in the fandom. And every now and then you meet a third type, a chosen one, if you will, who is just the consumer of all. And so one of the great boons of my life is that I am a Sam and a Charlie. So I get Sam telling me to watch X, and I get Charlie telling me to watch Y, and I watch all of it, and it's great.
This is true.
The chosen one.
The Watcher.
This is your anime. It's about
Not
just
my
being...
words, but my words.
I love it.
So, Jerry here, we're going to talk a little bit about Legend of the Galactic Heroes. Now, if you go back and listen to our sci-fi episode, you'll hear me talk about this show. But at that point, I'd only watched 25 odd episodes, which I'd watched in preparation to do that episode. And really, I think, if anything, I undersold it. And it's only been in subsequent episodes that I've actually talked about the show itself and how much I really loved it after you consume the whole thing. 110 episodes. There's also a 52 episode prequel series. There's a whole bunch of stuff. There's a remake right now. There's a whole bunch of things going on. But I believe it to be one of the greatest pieces of fiction ever made. I'm dead serious about this. Now, Gerald, I'm going to throw to you. What did you think of Legend of the Galactic Heroes, Gerald?
So first of all, thank you for recommending it, because I think I am, like, big picture, right up there with you. I was staggered by it. And it's one of those ones that you read about as being kind of, well, you might not have heard about this, but it's actually quite excellent. I was just walking around when people would ask me, like, what have you been watching? People that had no interest in anime, like film industry people, and I would just go at them for like half an hour about this space opera from the 80s that had like absolutely blown my socks off. Now, the qualifier is that I did watch it while I was out with COVID.
Yes.
And 110 episodes is a lot of episodes.
It is.
And I'm not sure outside of that context whether I would have like watched it in that concentrated next way that I did, but I'm so glad that the planets aligned, because I too am extremely excited to talk to you about this show.
Why don't you tell us what it's about?
So Legends of the Galactic Heroes is based on a novel series by Yoshiki Tanaka and is about a humanity in a far-flung future that has been at war with two different versions of itself for like hundreds of years. You're just thrown into the conflict. And one side is, imagine 80s America, and it's capitalism and it's democracy and it's like sweet jackets and poofy hair. And on the other side is the empire, which is less of a democracy and more of a monarchy, more of like an imperialist kind of shtick. But imagine like Baroque Austria,
Prussia,
frilly coats meets spaceship, which when I saw that for the first time, I was just like, awesome, Baroque punk. Like, we needed that. Where have you been hiding my entire life? And
Baroque punk, I like it.
it's so great. You've got these two sides of humanity that have been battling for hundreds of years, and they are both trying to prove that their form of government and rule is right. And the story is told through a very vast canvas, which we'll get to, but principally through two protagonists. And they are both the young rising general stars of each of their respective sides. And the story follows their rise and really their relationship, but a relationship that's played out over this like vast spectrum of intergalactic warfare, and not so much, through talking. But that's my little summary.
That's pretty damn
Now
good.
I want to go watch it all now. That was a great summary.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I, just for disclosure of my contribution to this episode, I left it a bit too late to try and binge watch Legends of the Galactic Heroes, and I oversold my ability to watch a kind of like, it's not really a slow burn, I wouldn't say. You get thrown right into the drama.
It's
So
dense though.
It's dense. There's a lot of information, but I actually think that's one of its strongest points, is that you are just thrown into this like completely like full-blown war that has been going on for like, it's not like we saw the start. There was like a spark that set it off. It was like, we're in the middle of this, and anyway.
Hundreds of years of warfare, yeah.
But it's very distinctive, the two sides. I think it's pretty cool. I think it was hard for me to binge. I think I didn't come at it from the right angle. Should have watched it when I was sick. But I will watch it next time.
Yeah. We'll do our best to keep selling you through today, but I'm even excited to hear like what those first impressions were of those first episodes, because I think a lot of the barriers that people have to watching it, and as I said, I think like if I didn't have COVID, I may have been in like this camp, is you kind of have to push through the beginning a bit because it does take a little while to not just find its rhythm, but for you to settle into the rhythm of the show.
I think that's a pretty good statement for both the shows we're talking about today, actually. Not Attack on Titan level, like,
You're writing,
like,
the hook.
bam, like, whoa, okay, what was that? Like, both kind of pilots for these shows, especially, are just like, okay, like, what?
Yeah.
I guess. Like,
Yeah.
both of them. And so which is interesting as well, because, I'm considering we're proclaiming them undisputed kings, but then not to say there aren't flaws to both of them, right? And yeah, the big thing about Legend of the Galactic Heroes, and I mentioned this before on the podcast, but so Gigok, who is one of the big famous anime YouTubers in the world, describes this show as the final boss of anime. So it's got a real reputation in the industry, or the community, sorry, as like, and also a lot of people roll their eyes when someone comes in and goes, no, my favorite anime is Legend of the Galactic Heroes, because everyone's like, oh, he's an insufferable wanker,
Yes,
which isn't
yes.
false, but like,
I have definitely rolled my eyes many times when you've said it.
but it's what it does.
It's like the War and Peace of, like, you're kind of like, okay, that's
Yeah.
my favorite book. It's like,
Cool guy.
Dostoevsky, yeah. What that's actually not inaccurate. Because like, and not to be like, well, because a lot of the subtext around people who like the show, myself included, is kind of like,
you didn't get it.
It's literature, you know what I mean? Like, it's based off a 10-novel series. Maybe you're just not ready for that. You know what I mean? And that's a problem with it, because like, you don't want to be that guy.
No.
But I mean, maybe you're not ready for it. So
Oh my God.
But here's the thing.
I
Here's the
hate
thing.
this.
There are so many shows and texts in the world that aspire to that level of broadness.
That's true.
And I was so ready to consign this one to a kind of like, almost, try, because it's such a demand, those kind of vast operatic kind of narratives with so many moving parts. Each of them have to be working because it only takes one for the whole thing that's been stretched thin to kind of crumble.
Yes.
And I think like as a big picture, what's so impressive about this is that like all of the bits work and you get to the ending and it like makes some like really bold choices along the way and you're like left with this 5,000 piece puzzle and you're like, oh, look at all the pieces that just go together perfectly. And it's just such a beautiful thing to behold in its completion. But again, you have to get there, and it doesn't feel at every part of it like, oh, I'm in the presence of greatness. It's kind of as a whole, you have to weigh it.
I also watched it, not while I had COVID, but while we were under lockdown last year in Sydney. So I, again, was in a fortunate position. And I remember it was like, because I'm getting old. I've gone on my days of like just binging show, like 25 episodes in a day. I don't really have the time to do that as much anymore as I used to, right? But I did with this. And I had I had the space to do so. But I would like say goodnight to my partner and then just like go downstairs, sit on the couch and watch literally 12 episodes back to back. And just be like, oh my God, I can see through time. It was like, it was intense. I think, and you said it to me when we were on the phone, because Gerald was, of course, calling me throughout. We were having long phone conversations because I'd watched it and then Gerald had finally taken my advice and watched it. And we were just having these chats of being like, man, it stays with you. It stays with you. And I still think about it over a year. Yeah, about a year now since I watched it all. And it just, the density of the storytelling, the character development, the historical, if you're a history nerd, once again, we're back to history. History happens to be fun, Charlotte.
I had to eat my words, and that was one of our best episodes we ever did. I really
Stop doubting
did.
me, man.
Look.
History's fun, people.
History
Don't
is-
let anyone tell you
You
otherwise.
can give Sam 1 point.
One
Like a
point.
ledger.
There you go.
Look, I'm now going to make another proclamation. As you mentioned, 2 protagonists. Now, is it deuteragonist or deuteragonist? What is the...
A dual protagonist.
Yeah, but there's a word. It's like deuteragonist, I think.
News to me.
I'm pretty sure it's deuteragonist. It might be deuteragonist. Don't come for me, TikTok.
The discourse has left me behind again.
There is a term for having dual protagonists, which isn't dual protagonist. But anyway, let's just say dual protagonist so I don't keep mispronouncing that word. Dual protagonists. Now, rare.
Yep.
Obviously, another show that does it really well and I think is probably heavily influenced by this is, of course, Death Note, which has, but of course, not quite to the same degree. But Death Note does run 2 protagonists for quite a long time. But both of these characters, I mean, you're going to have a favorite. I do. Now, what's interesting about these 2 characters is they're very, very different. And what Japan has this wonderful thing, the same with Death Note, is they have this thing about the honor, the nemesis conflict. Now, a nemesis conflict is always fascinating to me. I love nemesis conflicts. It's the classic detective story, always a nemesis, chasing the serial killer, but there's a weird respect. Not necessarily in those particularly, but like in the Japanese context, the respect these enemies have for one another. You see it all in samurai stuff as well with, the great honor of fighting. You see it in all shonen, the honor of fighting someone at full power. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing just distilled down into any kind of respect you have for another person, right? And this is obviously a war, and they're two great generals battling each other in two different ideological philosophies of politics.
Yep.
And they're going at each other, and it's interesting because they're so different, but they're both so compelling in their own way. And it also really shines a light on the two different political systems, because it's not a simplistic like democracy good, autocracy bad. In fact, if anything, it's probably harsher on democracy than it is on autocracy.
Definitely shines a light on both.
It shines a light on both. And now what's interesting about Yang is that Yang is actually a historian. He is a reluctant protagonist, which is interesting because I know you don't like passive protagonists.
Protagonists that don't take action, that are
Yes.
too reactionary. Yang,
Yes.
despite his motivations being complex, does take action.
He
so
does.
he's not truly a reluctant protagonist.
This is true.
Even in the pilot, he's not reluctant at all.
It gets different. Like it turns out the difference is Reinhard is like the most driven character you'll ever meet. Like Reinhardt's whole thing is like, this is a system. This is a broken system, which is something that I will fix through sheer force of will. And he dominates. That's his whole shtick. Whereas Yang is like, no, I am part of a system that is bigger than myself. The whole system is predicated on it being bigger than the individual. We all are cogs in a much larger machine, and it only works if we all work together. And if anyone tries to become a bigger cog in that machine, then it'll break. And that's very interesting because there are so many times when Yang is given an opportunity to take charge and to do a Reinhardt, and he never does.
So I think like what you've like touched on in all of that is kind of the three big reasons that really separates this show or like really elevates it. The characters are dynamite.
Yes.
As you touched on, Reinhardt, who's the Empire, Yang, who is the
Three Planets Alliance.
right, the role of history
Yes.
and how like that is both an aesthetic experience thing, but also a story driver.
Yes.
And then just theme. And how deeply it explores how humans govern ourselves collectively and as individuals, and what is it to be a person.
Yes.
And to go to what you were saying about how they respect each other and this dual protagonist relationship. And by the way, like dual protagonist narratives are all built on the tension of these two characters drifting towards and away from each other.
Yes.
The motto is like lives in parallel. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. And so in the good ones, yes, there's spaceships blowing up, but what's really like sizzling your bacon is just like, oh shit, they might actually end up in a room together soon.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes this show so incredible is that despite all of the, geopolitics and space battles, what you're most amped for is like just these two people having a conversation. So that's happening.
Yeah.
And it really, watching it, made me nostalgic for a kind of political discourse that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Respecting your enemies. I'm guilty.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
right, and everyone else, but like the world would be a better place if we did.
It's 100% true.
First episode sends him a note
Yeah.
and says like, that was a good play.
Well played.
Basically.
Yeah. It's like, you got me.
And
Yeah.
I love that it's like Yang already, he has a reputation. It's not like he was just like, a janitor working that suddenly had to be like, but I'm a genius, kind of thing. Like he has got a long history of that. And I think that's another thing, the history of the fact that Reinhardt knows who he is. Like that's and I think that's cool.
Let's talk about the characters.
Yeah. We got to do that.
Let's deep dive. So we'll start with your favorite. I'll let you take Yang because I know he's your boy.
Yang is quite possibly the greatest character in all of fiction. Again, a character at war with themselves is always interesting. Yang joins the military because he wants the education, because he wants to go and study history. That's why he joins. But then, of course, he sort of keeps getting promoted because he's just the best. But he kind of hates that. And so what's very interesting about him, and he's also very reflective about the deaths that he causes, and that weighs heavily on him. And it's very interesting. So again, you've got this character, and also it's interestingly reflected in his protege, in Julian, who sort of starts off as kind of like his assistant, I suppose, brings him tea and whatnot and tells him to sleep.
Tells him he's working too hard, does the
tells him to
dishes.
stop drinking and because he's a big old boozer. And I just think that everything he does is conflicted, but then he does have a core base which he won't budge upon. And I think that's an inherently interesting character, especially when you look at Reinhard, who is someone whose whole mantra is
Don't cut my lunch.
I'm
Sam.
sorry,
We're going to get to him. We're going to get to him.
I'll stop, Ryan.
I'm going to talk about all the female characters.
Okay, you know what? You know what? That's a fair point.
Sorry.
That is a fair point. If we're going to criticize this show, and we must for balance,
Look,
not going to pass any Bechdel tests anytime soon.
she sings the opening theme. It's fine. His beloved sister.
The opening theme is incredible.
It's made in the 80s. We should have put that up top. Yeah.
Okay, so like that's, if you're looking for representation, you're not going to find it here, unfortunately. And that is a criticism, and it's very fair. There are some interesting female characters, but there's like 2, whereas there's literally 50 amazing male characters. So that is a problem, no question. But this is a time capsule, is because of its time. The novels were written in the 70s and 80s, and the actual show was made in 1988 and ran until about 2000, with many different production companies across it as well. Look, if it was to be remade in the West or something, you would put a lot more representation in, obviously, and it wouldn't affect the story in any way, shape, or form. In fact,
That's
it would
the thing.
probably strengthen it. It would definitely strengthen it.
Funny you should mention that, because someone asked me recently, like, if you could adapt anything, what would you adapt? And I like immediately went into my spiel about Legends of the Galactic Heroes, and then someone quite rightly said, "Oh, so you want to exploit Japanese culture?" I was like, "Oh no, oh no." You can check that. But,
Well,
yeah.
interesting, because again, if we're going to go and talk about Koichi Iwabuchi's concept of cultural odorlessness, which is something we've brought up a few times in many different things, but basically the concept from Iwabuchi, who's a Japanese social theorist, is that much of Japanese media is culturally odorless in that it doesn't reflect the positive nature of Japanese society, whereas a lot of American cultural products are very much rah, 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 USA, American dream, especially the things which are broadcast overseas, the Hollywood blockbusters, right? Not to say there aren't incredibly critical shows, The Wire and whatnot, which excoriate American, cultural ideas. But Japan in particular, especially like when you look at these things and you go like, again, Pokemon, not super Japanese. Which is why it was so massive appeal, right? And it was deliberately culturally odorless. Dragon Ball Z, even to a degree, these things we didn't even recognize as anime as kids because they weren't like so obviously Japanese culturally. And now you can see them in there, but
Do you think that's to do with being a fantasy or a sci-fi setting or something that takes things out? Like, I think you could argue that for many things, even Western.
Absolutely.
Like,
no question, it's
yeah.
everywhere, but it's a particularly big thing in Japanese, I think. Attack on Titan. Super culturally odorless. It's in fact a European setting. If anything, Legend of the Galactic Heroes, basically the fact that it is so odorless and the fact that that Tanaka, the author, is heavily influenced by all sorts of history. Now, none of the characters are actually specifically based on a single historical figure, but he is heavily influenced by European and Asian history to the point where he is, but he denied any of the major characters influenced by a specific figure. However, some are more prominent than others. So Admiral Young Wenli parallels Yi Sun Sin, who was a famous South Korean general who lived from 1545 to 1598. Now, both Yi and Yang come from humble beginnings, but never lost a battle across their military careers. Also, both were heavily distrusted by their superiors, who feared they could seize power from the established rulers. Yi's most famous victory occurred at the Battle of, Myeongyang, I think I've horribly mispronounced that and I apologize to anyone who's South Korean. But where, despite being outnumbered 333 ships to 13, he managed to disable or destroy 31 Japanese warships without a single loss of his own. So that's, while he's not directly influenced, there's quite clearly a heavy parallel there.
And that goes to the heart of what makes Yang special, right? Like he, as you say, the historian that just wants to study, he doesn't want to engage in warfare, and yet to fund his university, he ends up in the military, and then because of his skills, but they call him the magician because he can pull victory from the jaws of whatever that saying is.
Jaws of defeat.
like no one else.
Yeah,
And
Miracle Yang.
Yeah.
I have very limited experience with the greatest character ever created for fiction, but he definitely stuck out to me from the two. Sorry, but I think that one thing I liked was even just, and as you were saying, he definitely takes to heart the deaths and that kind of thing, and he definitely would rather not be in the military, which is interesting.
Yes.
And even in the second episode, I think there's a memorial service held for the people that died, and he doesn't want to go, even though they want him as like a puppet to be there because he's always known as like the hero of this war or the hero of this battle, and he's just like, no, like
Yeah.
they don't like.
They try
It's
to
about
exploit him.
the
Very-
people. Yeah,
He's very cognizant of the ideals of democracy and the role that a military should play for its citizens, but then also the way in which politicians leverage the populism of the military to, pursue their own ends, which is also a hallmark of democracy. So
Exactly.
and this is the contradiction you were talking about. Like he wants the ideal, but has to battle against the. And so Reinhardt, the other
Yes.
guy,
other guy.
There we
who
go.
I won't say is my favorite, but I like them both kind of the same. I'm
Yeah.
less
good
cold
thing.
on Reinhardt than you are.
I like Reinhardt, but it's just Yang for me is just so superior. But
You know,
Does-
Sam can't like two people the same amount though. Like you got to have your favorite.
Obviously.
That's just how you roll, and that's great.
Yeah,
but
that's fine.
I think in a show with dual protagonists, that's
well, one's better than the other.
And
That's
so
fair.
if Yang is the magician, Reinhardt is the warrior.
Yes.
And so, but with Yang, his rhetoric is, hey, democracy, that's good, right? And so as a viewer in the West, I think you're predisposed to say, okay. And so there is something interesting going in the way that they humanize a kind of monarchical empire kind of system that I think we're predisposed to be like, well, this is wrong and ain't, too old fashioned and all the things. And so Reinhardt starts off at the bottom of that environment. His family are fallen nobles. And so he has to start from a version of the bottom, not quite the bottom.
He's still
but-
elevated, but
yeah, and so his wound is that his sister is taken to be the king's consort because she's so beautiful and doesn't get a choice. And we did mention again the 80s things.
there's some
and,
problems. Yep.
but he takes it upon himself. It's like, well, if I've been like rendered powerlessness, so powerless that my favorite sister could be taken from me, my only recourse then is to become the master of the universe. And so if you imagine like the many millions of personalities that exist out there, he's the one in a million that actually has the skills and the nous to do it.
Yes.
He can't do it by himself. He's got a kind of important ally that
Kirky Ice. Yes.
yes, who helps him do it. And his story is about rising through a system that he recognizes is corrupt and needs changing. But at the same time, he's not prepared to take it all the way to democracy, and he still wants to hold that kind of Kaiser position. And he's an interesting character in that way.
Yes. Look, Reinhardt is a fascinating character, and I must say the thing that shocked me the most about this show in general, as in where I found myself, obviously Yang is my favorite character, but I also sort of found myself siding with Reinhardt on the political side of the things, where I was like, there's an old saying that the greatest form of any kind of governing body is a benevolent autocracy, and that's what Reinhardt goes for. The problem, obviously the historical problem with that is that once that benevolent, always incredible human being dies, it's filled by an heir who's often a dud, and this is the thing. And like, also you get North Korea when this happens, because in the worst possible sense, right? But like, what they showed here was like how much one man can get done, and when everyone gets on the same page, and when what the vision is not pure, but I guess utilitarian and merit and a bit of a meritocracy, at least it's something that is to be aspired to. And problem is, of course, it all hinges on one person, and that's the inherent flaw with it all, right? But I found myself a lot of the times being like, yeah, you know what? Democracy is fucking stupid. Like,
Well, they do put the boots into democracy.
They
and-
really put the boots in.
And it's great,
Yeah.
because as much as like Yang's greatest enemy is Reinhardt, it's actually the system that he's trying to subscribe to.
Absolutely.
So as you were saying with Reinhardt, if he's this one in a million candidate that takes a hold of a broken system and molds it in his image and kind of makes everything better, even if he does end up on the top, I think what this show does really well is shines a light in the way democracy can be pulled in that same way, but by less worthy people.
Yeah.
And one of Yang's great antagonists in the show is this politician who's just the exact opposite of him. He's
Job Truitt.
yes, and he's just out for himself in the shameless way that we kind of suspect all politicians are, and is willing to mortgage the whole world essentially to put himself first. And Yang gets put in a position where his recourse is to take power for himself. But of course, he can't. That's not who he is. And there's a really interesting series of plot lines that the show goes into making your skin crawl about how democracy can be taken, and is really cool.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of the whole show, because even though Yang's my favorite, I actually am sort of like, well, Reinhardt's got a better system. Like this system stinks. Like, and yeah, it really does shine a light on it's not clear cut. It's not as just like Reinhardt good, Yang good, Reinhardt bad. It's actually very complicated, and really it brings you back and forth, and it really makes you sit there and question the system of democracy, which we all take as being pretty much axiomatic. You know what I mean? Capitalism and democracy are just things that there's no other option in the West. None. And it's like, well, obviously I'm not trying to say, let's go back to dictators. How good's that? Obviously not, but there's got to be some way of sophisticating our system. And it just feels like no one has the time. I'm not going to get into a socialist talk. Again, don't worry, Einstein's not getting quoted. Neither is Marx. But,
Einstein's socialist quote. I was like, what?
You got to think outside the box, man. All I'm going to say is I just love this show so fucking much. And it is really, really something that like, I say changed me because that's a bit wanky, but it changed me. No, honestly, fuck that. I love this show so much. It really is something that is like one of the things that I will always have in my top 5 favorite things, not just animes, things of all time. I really believe it to be that special. And I think you feel the same, right?
Yeah, similar. It's it was one of those shows that I watched and I was so unhappy that more people didn't know about it because it deserves to be known.
Yes.
That's as far as I'll like push the wank level. But I felt like incensed. I was just like, this is a
crime,
an incredible piece of filmmaking that no one knows about.
Yeah. It's a crime, no one knows more about it.
And Charlie.
It's hard to get into because of a couple of
Yes,
things.
that's true.
Despite me wanting to be like, it doesn't matter how old an animation is or how like clanky, or I think a lot of it is hard to find. Only streaming services on is High Dive.
Yep.
Number 2 is that it is an 80s anime, and it is.
Yeah, it
I mean,
looks terrible.
I mean, aesthetically, it's cool. Like I have to
Yes.
say, aesthetics wise, I think it's like really. I think it's come back in fashion. I think people will be into it now.
Yeah.
But
The space fights.
Space fights, that's fine by me. To me, it's like the standing there, mouth flap. That there's like, it's but it is very it's an 80s animation, so it's got to be clunkier. We're used to very smooth animation, and we're not getting that. But I still think it's really cool. I actually aesthetically was pretty into it.
Yeah.
I do think. I'm just asking you guys a question now. Do you think this is the best example of a space opera that we have, like out of everything? And do you think things are influenced by it, or do you think it's one of those things that kind of bypassed it? Do you think that like the creator of The Expanse knows about this show?
It's a good question.
It's a good question. Funnily enough, like when I was doing this, after I finished watching it, I went down this rabbit hole of just like, holy shit, how did I never hear about this? And in the West, there's not much chatter about it. There's a few articles that, the best anime you've never seen, but it's not linked to things the way Cowboy Bebop is linked to everything as an influence on Western filmmaking. But to answer your question about like, is it the best space opera ever? I'm like inclined to think it is. And part of the reason is the way that it deals with history.
Yes.
And like leverages this idea of history as a narrative device. And you would have seen this even in the first few episodes where there is a narrator. And normally I hate narrators.
Yeah,
I'm like,
it's a lazy technique,
don't tell me what's going on. There's so much going on that little text flashes on the screen to tell you who the characters are.
Because there's that many.
The cast is so big, you need a little reminder to tell you that that's John from the third, etc. But in leveraging all of these devices, it kind of feels like you are watching a history textbook.
Yes.
Which actually just goes to reinforce and amplify all of the realism that he's put into it in terms of these like political systems. And like we spoke at the start about how we come in and humanity's fighting. It's just like, hey, you know how we're trash? We're still trash, And it just like, it all kind of plays. So there's this really interesting aesthetic experience to the show that I haven't had anywhere else. And it just is so effective. It says it's going to tell you the history of the human race through fiction, and it does.
Yeah. And what's interesting, there is a remake I mentioned. It's currently in season 3, airing right now. Actually, season 3 is. It's made by Production IG, who did Haikyuu and Psycho Pass, and it is what everyone wanted in respect to the fact that it's Legend of the Galactic Heroes with modern animation, and it looks really cool. And it is. I've watched a bit of it, but the difference is it nixed the narrator, so the narrator is gone from this. So as a result, it's not actually a remake; it's like a reimagining. It's a retelling of the story. And I think where it actually falls down is exactly that, because it shies away from that storytelling technique of being kind of like a almost like a documentary series in a way, which is how they've sort of framed it with the narration in the way that is very historically balanced and placed in the storytelling techniques. And they've gone away with that with Die New Thies, I think it is called. It's a German. Again, I've killed that pronunciation, but yeah, that's the new one. And look, I mean, you check it out if you want. Like, again, I haven't watched enough of it to say if I like it or not. Obviously, it's Legend of the Galactic Heroes, so it's good. It's a good story. But I think if you really want the full experience, you need to go and watch the original, I think. And I mean, I can't speak to how good, and it's still only in its third season. But they've skipped a lot of things. They've condensed it a lot, which I guess, is a solid move if you're going to update the show. I get it. But like, there's something very nostalgic, romantic even about this old style of storytelling, which I think is very special. And you're right. We don't see it very often.
Well, I will say about that, having watched a lot of anime and having watched a lot of anime from different decades, I think at a certain point, anime became self-aware about itself in the way that all art forms do. But the original series isn't an anime trying to be an anime. It's just an anime trying to adapt these novels as well as it can. It's not like selling an idea of itself. And I found that super refreshing because even all of the amazing things that come out now, they're still playing to that rule book of what an anime is.
Yes.
And so whilst it is dated, it still feels fresh in that way because it's kind of like anime before it had an idea of itself.
100%. And look, history again, I'll just quickly go on Reinhard. So again, none of these characters are direct correlations to any historical figure, but Reinhard parallels many, but probably most accurately, Frederick the Great, the famous Prussian general who lived from 1712 to 1786 and was a king of Prussia from 1772 till 1786, where his death. Frederick sought reform off the back of his many military victories. He also sought an enlightened monarchy and purged the court of much corruption and promoted people to positions on their merit and aimed to implement a sort of meritocracy across the whole society. So here's another good one. Also, as we mentioned before, Kirkiais, who is his sort of best friend.
It's 2IC.
His 2IC.
An emotional support system.
Exactly. And the relationship between Reinhard and Kirkiais paralleled the relationship between Alexander the Great and Hephaestion, who was his close friend and second in command. And there's also kind of a, is a historical question. But also what's interesting about Reinhard too, which I find interesting as a character, is that he isn't driven by trying to find a romantic partner. Now, a character ends up coming into that space, but like it's a very utilitarian kind of like relationship that they have. And he's not driven by that, which is also a fascinating exploration of his character. He is just like, no, I have one goal and everything else is superfluous, which makes him very, very intriguing. Whereas Yang is much more, he actually has a wonderful relationship with his partner. And it's, in many ways you could be like, Yang is way happier. But like, I don't know, I suppose Reinhardt's just has different ideas.
He looks at his romantic partner through the prism of the problem that you raised before. Is that once he achieves his goal, he realizes that the fragile part of the system is that he has to pass it on to his heir, and so he has to have one. And so, what does that look like, and who with, and who best suits that? And again, it takes a very
utilitarian.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the last thing I'll say about this before we roll on
one?
to the other undisputed king that I'm looking forward to talking to is that I'm a big believer in like judging a show by two currencies. That's cool moments and oh fuck moments.
Yep.
And everything else aside, all the other like wanky things aside, as a bit of entertainment, in the way that, we might enjoy Game of Thrones or whatever, this show had some like proper oh fuck dramatic moments. Like It's not all like a history textbook. There are some like moments that absolutely floored me more than most things do. So if you haven't been taken on the political discourse between systems, that's fine.
That's fair.
Put it aside.
That's fair.
Some like hectic shit is going to happen. And it's going to be great.
Hectic stuff. Look, I hope that sold it to you, but just a hidden gem and something that I really strongly suggest if you got some time, because naturally it's sort of, and again, I don't think it's one of those shows you can sort of knock an episode off every now and then. There's too much going on. It's too dense. But if you find yourself with a bit of time, hey, maybe there's another lockdown. Who knows with this COVID shit? Everyone's got COVID again. But if you do find some time and you really just want to have a crack, again, yes, not an easy start, not an easy watch, but I promise you, you'll be rewarded by this, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Legend of Galactic Heroes, one of the two undisputed, unrecognized kings. Now, let's move on to something entirely different. Let's change gears.
The natural progression of things.
Charlie, take it
The
away.
spiritual successor of Legends of the Galactic Hero. No, we're going to talk about Fruits Basket. And I have talked about this show at length before on this podcast many times because I'll use any excuse to bring it up. Now, this one I think is a harder sell to the everyday non-anime, non-Shōjo fan
That's fair.
than Legends of the Galactic Hero, where you're like, this is outstanding history. And like, I'm kind of like, this is a show about a girl who finds herself living in a family that when she hugs someone of the opposite sex, they turn into an animal. And everyone's like, what? And I'm like, yeah, that's literally the
Excuse me?
storyline. And I'm like,
literally
better
it.
watch it. So I was so happy when Gerald watched it. I was like, thank you so much, because now I can talk about it with someone. And at the same time, another friend of mine was like, you know what? Fuck it. I'll give Fruits Basket a spin. And she got obsessed as well. And so I was getting, similar to you when Gerald was calling you, I was getting Facebook messages from Gerald just being like, And I love seeing you go from being like, what the fuck has Charlie made me watch, to being like, oh, I get it, to then like, oh no, I really get it. And it's one of those shows where, I mean, we just gave the synopsis then, but it's based on a 1998, I believe, manga series, Shōjo, meaning that it's, I think it's actually probably a bit more mature than like younger teenage girls. Like it actually has a lot of really hectic, like a lot of trigger warnings in this show. It's all about trauma, and a lot of these characters have a really bad time, and which is upsetting because you love them all by the end, but that's a thing. It's about Toru Honda, who is a high school girl whose mother has just recently passed away. She's recently orphaned. She's been taken in by her grandfather, whose house has just been renovated. So she's told him that she's moving in with a friend, but actually she's like, no, I'm going to go camp in the woods because I feel she's one of those characters that really doesn't ever want to put people out. So she goes, I'm just going to go camp in the woods. Anyway, she doesn't realize she's camping on a property that's owned by the Soma family, which is this huge clan, I want to say, like big kind
That's
of.
probably more accurate, isn't it?
Yeah. But
dynasty.
There's some questions about that.
yeah, and basically one of the boys from her class, Prince Yuki, lives on the house and that property, and they find her camping there, and they're like, okay, there's a landslide and her tent and all her belongings get destroyed, so she has to move in with them. And so starts a series of events where she finds out about the Soma family curse, which is 12 members of the Zodiac. It's 12, right?
13, actually.
13 members of this zodiac, but the 12, the Chinese zodiac it's a curse on the Soma family that 12 of them or 13 of them, when hugged by the opposite members of the sex, will turn into their cursed animals. So Prince Yuki, for example, is the rat, and there's a lot of, like, to do with the actual kind of, you know, background of what those zodiac animals mean in the legend of that kind of Chinese history and culture. So
Proverbs, yep.
the rat is the favored
Yes.
zodiac sign, and it kind of goes down the food chain, and there's a lot, but it's funny. You think that's the curse. You're like, that's kind of cute curse. No, there's more to that curse. And there's a lot of interesting family dynamics that Toru Honda finds herself having to navigate as an outsider. And as I said, such a hard sell. You're probably sitting there being like, I would never watch that in 1,000 years. I'm like, it's a high school romance story.
Comedy, which people love.
It is.
And
including me.
And it is
apparently.
funny. Like, it's one of those shows you're like, whoa, wow, it really gets you. I feel like you get a bit tricked by it because you start watching it and you're like, this is so cute. There's some cute, but they're all like, oh, the Soma's like the hottest guys ever. You know, you're like, wow, like I
Classic Shōjo.
wish I was dating all of those guys. Like, cool. And you're like, wow, I wish I was Toru Honda. Not really, because she's had an awful life and she's just trying her best.
She earned it.
Yeah. Yep. What's interesting about it is, I think you were saying that it has this, like, even when you're at the start of it and you're not quite kind of cluey into what's really going on, it has this sense of like foreboding, like you're
Yeah.
sort of like, well, something a bit off about the show. And then by the time you're in the third season, you're like, this is like it's trauma in a show. Like it's all about different kinds of trauma. It's all about coping mechanisms of
Generational trauma.
and also the ways in which these characters handle their trauma. And Toru Honda is such a good example because at first you're like, what a boring character. She's just like, I'm great and I'm fine. Everything's good. And then by the end you're like, oh man, she's kind of fucked up. Like that, her like relentless optimism is like really toxic. She can't let go. Like
That's just your self-defense mechanisms that stopped you crumbling into dust. You
yeah.
know?
And then when she kind of, the cracks do show, you're so like invested in this character, and it's not until like the third season where that really kind of goes in and you're like, oh my God, this poor traumatized child. Yeah, so I think Fruits Basket is actually a very subversive show because it has all the shoujo tropes. It is a shoujo. It is set there as cute boys, like a damsel in distress vibe. She's got her cool, you know, like hardcore friends and like there's all these different tropes.
Protector.
But really it's not about that at all. And it sort of uses those stereotypes to subvert your expectations and kind of show maybe why they're stereotypes in the first place and what people could be hiding under these sort of things. It's not a perfect series. It's a 1998 manga written, and there's a lot of problematic things in it. There's a lot of age gaps, a lot of like, you know, stuff like that I'm sure there's a lot of gender role stuff that I probably wouldn't be like, go team now. But I do think there are some amazing female characters in this show, really, really good ones, and male characters. And I think that it's got one of the best written villains. Like the antagonist is something that is like it's a bad person. You know what I mean? But
I like hated them.
Yeah.
Like I was like viscerally,
yeah.
you know, before things turn, one of the many turns. But you're like, oh, this person sucks because you're so invested in the characters and you're like, oh, this person, like, it's a great antagonist.
Yeah. And you're like, why does this person suck? They're like, why? And then you kind of understand more about the whole thing and you got to understand the curse and like all the kind of, and yeah, it's because it is really, at the end of the day, it is kind of a fantasy show, but that sort of takes backseat. Like the only fantastical element is the curse. Like that's it really.
Which only really, I mean, I've watched, just for pure disclosure, I've watched 1.5 seasons. So I'm about halfway through the whole thing. There are 3 seasons and I'm halfway through the second. And it's funny because there is something unsettling about it. I think is probably the best word, because there's this cosmic horror vibe that runs underneath the whole thing, but it does sit in that very, I don't want to say flippant, but like kind of high school hijinks and sort of, you know, surface level romance like stuff for quite a long time. In fact, a very long time. So I think it's just really interesting in respect to the fact that it does fill a space which feels both like well-worn, well-trodden ground, because look, I'm not a Shōjo fan. Obviously, it's not my demographic, but I have seen, you know, parts of lots of them, and it's pretty like often it's a very like generic high school rom-com, except when it's not. When it's not, you know, because of this cosmic horror vibe and this weird kind of, at first you're sort of like, what is this? Like, what's even the point of this? Why aren't they telling me what's going on? It's this kind of like weird, like, oh, by the way, there's this curse thing, but don't worry about that. It's kind of, forget about it. The cute boys are over here.
Why are all the scenes about high school, but I'm feeling so much dread about what's waiting at home? You know?
Yeah. And it kind of, and it does take a bit of time. It's 25 episodes per season. So 75 episodes.
I think the third season is only 12.
Only 12?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So not quite. So 62. But like it's you know, it's got, Fullmetal Alchemist is only 62, 63. So it's the same length. So it does take a bit of time to unfurl itself. And I haven't got to the proper meat, I suppose, of the story, because I'm about just over halfway through the whole thing. But I guess one of the drawbacks, I would say, one of the barriers is that it is a slow start. The whole first season is pretty slow. I mean, that's, you know, honestly, for me, again, I'm not the demographic for sure, but it is slow start. But once you start peeling away the layers of the onion, you can see something which, again, is a very unique experience.
So bear in mind, 2001, there was a Fruits Basket adaptation, and it just basically covered the first season. And it was very different. They went broad comedy with it. There was like no kind of foreboding, because they didn't cover the whole manga. Manga hadn't finished by then. I read the manga because I loved Fruits Basket, and I was like, this is very different. I was like, holy dooly, like, I got some real shit going here. And in season 1 of Fruits Basket, the first original, you would get none of that.
Really?
So that just worked as like a base level. But I loved it because I had a soft spot for it. But I think you do need that. You do need the length. It sounds like it's a long time to get like this kind of story, but because you've got so many characters and you need to care about all of them for it to work.
Sure.
And you get that time with these characters with this kind of, and it's also a brilliant, this 2019 one is a brilliant adaptation. It's beautifully animated.
Yeah, it looks great.
Like great soundtrack, and they put in a lot of care into it. So I think that they gave it like, as we call it, Fruits Basket Brotherhood. It's like they went back and they did it properly.
Yeah.
And they did a great job.
I found myself thinking about this show a long time after I'd finished watching it. And again, I watched it because I take your recommendation very highly. And also that it did keep like popping up as like top on like some like anime lists. And what you said, Sam, about that undercurrent of dread and that unsettling nature of it creates like a really like unique tonal experience. And that tonal balance is really hard to pull off. And they totally do, because I think ultimately like what you buy is that in the same way that we all live in multiple spaces in lives, like we can go to school or work and be happy and be consumed by the conflicts that exist there to try and escape, other things, but then to be pulled back into that later. Somehow it all feels holistic. And this may be like a bit of a stretch, but I almost think it's like Lynchian, like I think of Blue Velvet when I was watching this, because that starts with just a guy, almost Hardy Boys-esque, small town America, and he finds an ear and it's just like, gee whiz, guess I'm off to solve a murder, and things just get dark.
Yeah.
And this is very similar. And to go to the cosmic horror influence that you spoke of, Sam, sure, like if cosmic horror is stories that render the sum of all human action and emotion obsolete, so much of this is characters who are not free in the way the shoujo genre makes you celebrate youth as freedom, but are trapped by history and bloodlines. And that also reminds me of that Shadows over Innismouth Lovecraft, which is very based in racism and is no good. But, this is like, people are born. There's something in the bloodline, something inescapable, something that even if they go to school, they have to fear. And Toru, as this kind of antidote to other people's pain while she's harboring her own, is also a really interesting narrative dynamic. So, yeah, much more than what it seemed. And I'm haunted by it. I will be thinking about this one for years,
It's also one of those shows that I'm like, you will cry. People are like, I'm not going to cry at this show. And everyone's like, well, I cried at one point for sure. I was like, I cried the whole time. The whole third season, I was like, oh God. I think one of my favorite things about it is a huge cast of characters, and they really go into all of them. Like you really know all these characters. There's a couple, actually, there's two characters that get kind of like no one really cares about them vibes, but
the monkey's just like, get out of here.
Yeah, the monkey really never comes back.
One episode, and it's super annoying.
Yeah, but every other character, most of them in the Zodiac, I think they've got their own things. Even like their teacher has a storyline, kind of thing. And I love that. I love the kind of subversion of you've got a love triangle, right? But do you? The thing where you're kind of like, we've got a love triangle, but it's not what you think it is. It's kind of on a base level, yes, but how does one of them love her? What does that mean for them? And is it kind of, without spoiling anything, I think Yuki's an interesting character because he's got, he's the prince of the school. He's very good looking. He's very perfect and put together, but actually is an absolute mess. When she moves in with him, he just can't clean. Everything's fucked. He's completely all over the shop, but then feels this pressure to be perfect and kind of, and it is, I think it's interesting. And Shigure, who is one of my favorite characters, is just, the minute you meet him, you go, okay, this is the most off-putting person ever. But he's got this bravado, jokey energy, but you're up to something sus. And
he's the head of the household. There's the two.
Oh yeah, sorry, I should.
There's the two young guys who are kind of, I guess, act like he's their guardian, I suppose.
Yeah, they're his wards.
Yeah. So and he's the older figure of the house, and he's an author, and the dog.
And most of the members of the Soma family, including people who aren't a part of the Zodiac curse, and also it should be noted that only the people within the Zodiac curse and the head of the family know about the curse. But the Somas are I guess, a huge clan kind of thing.
They're not all blood related.
No, and they all live in
Thankfully.
a big, almost suburb together. It's this whole compound.
Yeah,
and they're really wealthy. But Yuki and Kyo and Shigure are the only ones to live out of the compound. So they live on a property
off
elsewhere.
Campus, yeah.
Yeah,
and that was kind of a taboo or a transgression to even want to pull away from the family by just moving out of the compound.
Yeah.
Which gives you a hint about some of the conflicts that lie in the heart of the show.
Yeah, it's just because I feel like obviously something like Legends of the Galactic Hero, I could see why that would be good. I'd be like, this is going to be great. But I'm like, I just feel like Fruits Basket is one of those ones that really surprises me and surprises people that kind of commit to it. But I understand that high school, it is at the end of the day, you have to go through a festival arc. You have to go through a play, but the play is the best bit, so don't worry about it. The Cinderella play, that's in season 3, and it's iconic.
But this is an example of something which is not culturally odorless. In fact, it's very Japanese in respect. The high school thing is a very Japanese, strictly Japanese context. You couldn't just put that in America; it wouldn't work. You know what I mean? And it's a Chinese zodiac, so it's transnational, Asian cultures sort of intertwining, which is quite interesting. But yeah, definitely not culturally odorless.
As Charlie said, like you have to understand the genre a little bit to have it subverted, you know? And
Yes.
I haven't watched a whole bunch of Shōjo, but High School Rumble is one of the funniest shows of all time. And even that is a context for how this subverts that kind of model is.
Yeah.
And Kaguya, so you would know this stuff from
And
Kaguya.
Kaguya-sama,
yeah.
exactly right, which so good.
Very, very good, but very
love that.
different. I love
couldn't be more different.
Yeah, I
But-
think because I think that you started watching this because you had finished Horimiya, right?
Yes.
And then I was like, you should watch Fruits Basket. It was like a different again though. Like that's very slice of life. Like Fruits Basket, people are like, it's slice of life. You're like, if my life was cooked, like, and I like, yeah, I guess like it's, but it is and it isn't. It has like those aspects of it. But
Again, I can't stress enough how I'll just watch everything. It's like a high school romance, I'll take it. Space opera, I'll take it. A show about a person rising up through a soccer club, it's like I will take it. I
Of
just want
course.
it all. But yeah, there's been I did go on a heater of like high school rom-coms, and this one was the cherry on top that was the perfect finisher because it just totally subverted all of those,
so
those
you could,
tropes.
yeah, it's one of my favorites for a reason, but I also can't look over the fact that I have nostalgic roots to it. Like, so I'd read it in high school. I loved it so much, and seeing it adapted, I was like, yes, finally. But I was very justified in the fact that it is, as you said, it pops up. Like I think for a minute there, for a hot second, it was number one on Mal.
It was until
And
the
everyone was-
Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood stands came and
Took
as
it
they
down.
do.
But it's still like in the top 10.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
it's one of those ones that people, I think even non-shoujo fans had to admit it was good.
Yeah, like you touched on it about like different types of love, and that's obviously a difficult theme to engage with, but I think the show does a really great job, just not in terms of the love triangle, but also the forced fraternity that exists between these people that are cursed, you know, and what, you know, the original curse, and this isn't really a spoiler, is that they had such fun at the gathering in the myth that they were kind of cursed to repeat it, that it's based on love, but over this time how everything is unspooled. So something that's supposed to be love is actually turned quite toxic, and that as an exploration is awesome. The ways in which people love each other despite that baggage is like beautiful. It is quite moving in that way, I will say.
And it's a frustrating watch at the start when you don't quite understand that level of the curse, because you're like, why are these people just leaving this like
Toxic
just being
one,
like,
yeah.
I'm out, this is cooked kind of vibe, and you're like, no, there's more to that, and I think I think that people would find that hard to leave a toxic situation regardless of having a curse. So I think having that as like a plot narrative, like as a thing that's there, like a plot point is helpful to kind of make that.
Oh yeah, family.
Yeah.
is like,
Can't choose them.
Yeah. Gosh, you're telling me. Sorry.
Charlie won the podcast.
Oh, cheap shot.
No, that was a dunk, Sam. That wasn't.
Yeah, but I could tell that Sam wasn't going to love Fruits Basket. Like I knew that.
I don't like dislike it or anything. Like I like it. I like it. It just hasn't got me like in the way that it has you two. You know what I mean? Like I think I'm getting there. Like I was even watching it some last night, like to smash as much as I could before we did this show. And I do. I really feel like it occupies a unique space, and for that, I think it's really interesting, and it is unique. It is something that I'm like. Again, I'm not the target demographic. I'm just not, but it holds my interest enough, and it's something where I was like, sometimes after about halfway through season 1, I was like, fuck this. I'll just skive off on this, like I'll let the other two talk about it, but I kept being like, no, but it's interesting enough, and it kept bringing me back in. And now even last night, like no spoilers, but something did happen, and I was like, okay,
A little pebble in the
I might
pond
keep
right
coming-
there.
I will finish it. You know what I mean? I absolutely will. And then I might change my tune. And again, I'm not trying to say that it's not good. It is really good. But again, what I think is most interesting about it is its uniqueness. And it just fills a very unique space in and amongst so many genres which all fit together in one, and it's many different things all at once. But then it is itself, which is quite interesting.
And it's a character study at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
so
Which,
the,
you
like-
love that.
yeah. And I think that I think we were just like, who's your favorite character? Like, it's a big old, like, amazing cast of characters to choose from, that kind of thing. They all stick with you. And even ones that you find really annoying at the start end up being best boy by the end. So
Well, I did
don't
message you
worry.
that time. I was like, I'm the rabbit in my birth year. And I was like, who am I? And I was like, cool. Oh, the annoying little shit. And I was like, boo! Boo! Why am I not the cat?
Because the cat doesn't exist.
Yeah,
in
but
the
he should
Zodiac.
because he's the best character in
okay.
the show. But anyway, but then I'm just like, ugh, look at this idiot, you know. And every time it's on the screen, I'm like, shut up, why don't you? Anyway, then all of a sudden his backstory happened, and I was just weeping. Like, I was like,
The show was just like, shh,
the
shh, shh, shh.
fuck, dude,
Just
it's
wait.
the saddest
Just wait,
backstory I've
por
ever
favor.
seen. Like,
It's so sad. And you're like, what an
he's
iconic
relentlessly
kid.
positive for a reason. It's a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting.
See, mine is actually the worst character in the show. So I'm the goat. So
Oh, you're the goat.
Yeah. And I'm like, God damn the goat.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
He is annoying. And he's as annoying as I am. So I'm like, just really sarcastic the whole time. And I'm like, well, great.
Well, there you go.
Love that.
Who
Thank
are you, Gerald?
I think the dragon.
The dragon. Oh, he's
Oh,
called the
come
doctor.
on. You are him in real
The
life.
doctor.
Well, there you go.
That's the biggest compliment I've ever given anyone.
That's a good
Hattori?
one.
So rare.
Tori's
So
a great
rare.
character. He's one of my favorites, actually.
Yeah, no, he's good.
Somehow has the ability to wipe minds. I don't know why, but
Because we are in a magical place where there's
Yeah,
people
a
cursed
lot-
by zodiac animals and turned into.
I was reading a few things, be like, oh, they never explain that. I'm like, they never explain why they're fucking animals either. Like,
Yeah.
don't worry about it. Like,
But
Yeah,
I
go
love
on.
that it's just like, what if I gave you the fantasy of a high school romance? You're like, I'm listening, but on top of that, we're gonna like stack the fantasy of like some magical animals. You're like, I'm with you, but then like fantasy plus fantasy equals the realest thing you've ever seen. By the end, you're just weeping. You know, I'm like, oh, you unzipped me. I don't know when that happened, but you did.
yeah, but you know, I think it's a really fascinating show, and I think it's something that everyone, you know, if you are into shoujo or if you ever watched anything like that and are interested in it, I think it's something which could be really interesting. And even if you aren't, like myself,
I reckon just if you're into subversions, you know,
100%.
like anything that takes something that you kind of recognize and like turns it on its head and does something tonally interesting, like, yeah, I think people that aren't super into shoujo will like it even more because it does twist.
Because the things you go to shoujo, because I don't mind shoujo, like I'm fine with that. I wouldn't say I'm the biggest like, yeah, like woo, but I have watched heaps of them. I usually go to it for like escapism, feeling nice and being like, oh, that was nice when the most popular boy fell in love with the least popular girl and the festival happened and yada yada. This is not that. You're not going to get that level of comfort watch from it. So I know what you're saying. Shoujo fans might be like, well, that was awful. Like I just sobbed hysterically.
Well, Gerald, thank you so much for coming on for the
Thanks for having
5th
me.
time. Thank you, my friend. Always a pleasure to have you in. Thank you for taking our recommendations. It means a lot to us.
Oh, keep them coming.
Okay. See, sometimes we don't have bad takes, but sometimes we do. But, you know, I'm really glad you got to watch them and experience them and, of course, share your very, very interesting and eloquent thoughts on those pieces. As always, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Look, Gerald, thank you so much. Everyone, we really appreciate your time. We hope you learned something today. We hope you go and watch these 2 shows because we love them so much. And of course, we'd like to thank our wonderful patrons. And they are, of course, Grant, Curtis, Dom, Rose, Christian, Caroline, Samantha, and Alex. You guys are the best. Thank you so much. You can join our Patreon if you want. Patreon.com/gateway to anime. You can, of course, find us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And hey, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.